So COVID-19 has really changed the lives of everyone in medicine. In fact, it's changed the lives of everyone across the country. So uniquely, you all have had the opportunity to go through a pandemic while also being in the middle of your dermatology training. Yep. So I know that you have lots of things to share, and we cannot wait to hear about your experiences.
This week in dermatology, Dr. Candrice Heath hosts a conversation on derm residency in the time of COVID. And in the news, we look back, we look ahead, and we look around. This is Dermatology Weekly by MD Edge, a weekly show featuring the latest news and information in clinical dermatology, followed by a peer-to-peer conversation about the most important topics in dermatology. I'm your host, Nick Andrews. Coming up in the peer-to-peer portion of the show, Dr. Candrice Heath is back, and she's joined by 3 recent or current trainees, depending on when you're listening to this, Dr. Brittany Oliver, Dr. Sophie Greenberg, and Dr. Julie Croley. They discuss what being a trainee during COVID was like and what it's like now. Remember, you can email Derm Weekly at podcasts@mdedge.com, and you can find us on Twitter at mdedgederm. This episode comes with show notes. They're robust. They have links and background information to the peer-to-peer portion of the conversation, as well as the news. You can find the notes wherever notes are found in your app. And now, what's new in dermatology? Today, we have something special. We look at infectious disease dermatology over the last 50 years. As we record this, 2020 marks the 50th anniversary of dermatology news. To celebrate the 50th anniversary, MD Edge is looking back at how dermatology has changed since the first edition. Today, we look at infectious diseases. One of the biggest wins for ID Dermatology over the last 5 decades has been the management of herpes, both herpes simplex virus 1 and virus 2, as well as herpes zoster virus. In 1981, the FDA approved acyclovir, and everything changed. Dr. Theodore Ted Rosen is a professor of dermatology at Baylor in Houston. Dr. Rosen was on Good Morning America all the way back then to give the first IV dose of acyclovir in the city of Houston. He remembers the show, and he remembers that the patient's case of disseminated herpes was bad. And he remembers that the drug worked. Now, in 2020, humanity is battling a virus with its fingerprint all over dermatology. It's a perfect time to look back. Dr. Ted Rosen was courteous enough to join me via Zoom to talk about the past, to talk about the future, and to talk about the current state of ID dermatology.
Hi, I'm Dr. Ted Rosen, professor of dermatology at Baylor College of Medicine in Houston, Texas.
Dr. Rosen, we're discussing the 50th anniversary of our publication and looking back on some of the big advances. And of course, you're at Houston now, which is, as we record this in the summer of 2020, a hotspot for a pandemic, and dermatology has been at the forefront of this pandemic. This is not your first foray into widespread outbreaks. As our 50th anniversary article discusses, you were involved with herpes and a bunch of other stuff. So how does this pandemic, in the scope of 50 years, how does this pandemic and this disease maybe bring you back mentally to what was going on 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago?
Well, as you mentioned, we've gone through all sorts of interesting periods. I mean, I can remember way back when scabies was the scourge. Everybody and everybody's uncle had it. It hasn't gone away, but at least we have some therapeutic interventions which are good and some brand new ones coming. Herpes, of course, genital herpes was the scarlet letter, and everybody was afraid of that, and we had no therapy for it. Of course, now we do, so you can not only treat an outbreak, but actually be put on medication that prevents overt outbreaks and shedding of the virus. We've had up and down episodes where syphilis was rampant, both in our locale and in other locales. There have been hotbeds, very much like the current virus, but we've always had at least 1 and usually 2 and sometimes even 3 antibiotics that would take care of it if it was diagnosed properly. I think what separates this particular one is, first of all, the fatalities. Yeah, the fatality rate may only be 1% or thereabouts, but when so many people get sick, that's a lot of people dying. And the other thing that separates it is we don't really have, I think, yet a handle on what to do for it. And is there a therapeutic protocol that works for almost all patients who get really sick? So, scratching from scabies is one thing. Dying from COVID-19 is another.
Yeah, completely unbelievable. And you said actually in the story, kind of an ominous foreboding quote, I'm going to paraphrase here, that no matter how smart we think we are, nature has a way of putting us back in our place, which couldn't be more accurate in this moment. And you mentioned that unlike previous things, this one doesn't have therapy. So I want to talk about some of those previous therapies you mentioned, which were antibiotics, obviously game changers. But what are your thoughts on, the next 5, 10, 30, 50 years and a problem that's sort of whirling underneath the surface in antibiotic resistance?
Well, I think you could even broaden that. The whole thing is, if you think about the first antibiotics were right around World War II, which is not that far past. And actually in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech, Alexander Fleming, the discoverer of penicillin, said, at some point, there will be bacteria that resist this miracle drug. He predicted that, the inventor. And what's happened is that all sorts of infectious organisms have literally learned to live with what we've developed to destroy them. So we have widespread antibiotic resistance, which is getting worse. And that's worsened by the emergence of new bacteria that we didn't even think of before. We even have fungal resistance, not very widespread, but certainly increasing, especially when we have new fungal pathogens we never thought of before. The parasites, head lice, a perfect example. We've been using the same pyrethroids for decades with no trouble, but now almost every state in a study done a couple of years ago had huge numbers of head lice that were resistant to the most inexpensive treatments. So, and scabies is learning to live with ivermectin, which is a relatively recent drug. So fungi and bacteria and parasites, and yes, even viruses can all develop resistance. And that is really a problem, because once you've done a lot of research and found out the way these organisms live and developed a way to block certain pathways, it's hard to find a new pathway to block.
Yeah, it's honestly unbelievable. I think it was my brother asked me when I was very young, are you more in awe of and terrified by the really big picture or the really small picture? And these microorganisms that just seem so much more willing to unite than we do. Sometimes it feels like it is awe-striking. But I want to switch a little bit to this idea of scope. We're celebrating 50 years here. And obviously you commented on that, and we've mentioned that a couple times. One thing that you said in the story that we're referencing, which you can find in the show notes, there's a link to it down there, that really struck me, and it's something that I'm passionate about here as a host and as a journalist, is about how it seems like physicians are spending less and less time with patients and at the bedside, but that the science, as we mentioned, has gotten so much better. The game has been changed in a lot of ways. So can you kind of juxtapose for me how perhaps the art of practicing patient-first medicine has maybe taken steps in the wrong direction, and how science, through identification and these different industries and drugs, have taken steps in the right direction?
So certainly we've made great advances, right? Both in diagnostic and therapeutic interventions. No doubt about it. But by the same token, the person, it's a human being who's ill. And especially with an infectious disease, which you have to think about, they caught it from somewhere or someone. They're worried about maybe they gave it to someone. There's a big personal problem involved here. And we tend to use our tools, our scientific tools, so rapidly and so extensively. I'm going to make the diagnosis, I'm going to find a therapy and get the person better. But we don't listen to the person. And I think part of that's a part of a general trend. If you think about when you go to your physician now, they spend most of the time looking down at their tablet or at their computer screen because the documentation requirements have gotten so severe that they forget about the patient who's in the room too. And especially with infectious diseases, I think there's an overlay there that really requires, whether it's a literal or figurative, laying on of the hands. Hand on the shoulder, you're going to be okay, Mr. Smith. I'm going to figure out what it is. I'm going to treat you. We'll make sure no one else has it. That's kind of been lost, I think, a little bit in bedside medicine. It's
one of the few things that I think all physicians seem to agree on, that the dataization and the artificial intelligence is good, but the data entry and the screen time is probably pretty bad. So last question, we were talking about this anniversary, and the field has come so far, dermatologists, venerologists, not that long ago, with syphilis as secondary symptoms and people going to dermatologists and finding out that they have syphilis. What do the next 10 years and 15 years look like for dermatology if things go well, and what is your reasonable estimation?
Well, I think, first of all, from a diagnostic standpoint, we will get extremely efficient and proficient. And that's because molecular diagnosis, slowly but surely, will be done literally at the bedside, your instant diagnosis, like you can go get the flu diagnosed. All the infectious diseases that afflict the skin will get, or most of them will get, to the point where we can make almost an instant diagnosis with molecular techniques at the bedside. Or at the very least, a sample will be sent off, and in 24, 48 hours, you will have a precise answer. So I think that's coming. The other thing, two things are, I think we have the capacity to expand our therapeutic armamentarium even more as we now use that technology. For example, artificial intelligence. There's a great article in the journal, I think it's Cell, within the last few months, where they used artificial intelligence. They programmed the computer to recognize what compounds would interfere with certain metabolic pathways in bacteria. And then they entered a whole bunch of compounds that aren't being used now. And they found one that looks like it's going to be a dynamite antibiotic.
Wow.
So we will discover new ways to treat and even more efficient ways to diagnose. The downside is, as I said and you quoted, there's always risk in nature, and mutations and alterations of organisms we've learned how to control somehow place them out of our reach yet again. This isn't the first SARS, right? We had SARS-1 a while ago,
MERS,
and it kind of mutated itself out of existence.
Yep.
But this one isn't doing that.
And with that, we'll bring our conversation to a close and wish you safety and health. You are in, as we record this, one of the big hotspots in the world, and hope you're staying healthy and taking care of your patients, and things are going really well for you. So thank you so much, Dr. Ted Rosen, for joining me.
Stay safe.
And a big thanks to Dr. Ted Rosen for participating in our article that you can read in full by clicking the link in the show notes. It goes much deeper into infectious disease dermatology. And we'd like to thank you for taking the time out of his day. He's in one of the hotspots in Houston as we record this in July 2020. And he took the time out of his day to discuss where dermatology has come, where it is, and where it's going. So we thank Dr. Rosen for that. Coming up after this, Peer-to-Peer with Dr. Candrice Heath. Welcome back to Dermatology Weekly. I am Nick Andrews. Remember, if you enjoyed this conversation or if you want to get a little deeper into it, there are links and show notes available wherever notes are found in your particular podcast app. Okay, please welcome the host of Peer-to-Peer, Dr. Candrice Heath.
Thank you so much for joining us. I am super excited for this episode of COVID Conversations with Dr. Candrice. Yes, I have added with Dr. Candrice to it because it just sounded so good. I couldn't help it. Well, today we have three amazing dermatology residents with us, and I'm super excited to introduce them. First, we have Dr. Brittany Oliver. Can you say hello to the people?
Hi, everyone. Very happy to be here as part of this conversation. Thank you for having me.
Wonderful. And Dr. Sophie Greenberg.
Hi, everyone. Also really happy to be here. I'm joining you from New York City today.
Great. And last but not least, someone who's not a stranger to this podcast, Dr. Julie Croley.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having us, Dr. Heath.
Oh, no problem at all. Well, of course, this series is entitled COVID Conversations. So COVID-19 has really changed the lives of everyone in medicine. In fact, it's changed the lives of everyone across the country and even the world, if you really think about it. So uniquely, you all have had the opportunity to go through a pandemic while also being in the middle of your dermatology training. Yep. So I know that you have lots of things to share, and we cannot wait to hear about your experiences. But, being a dermatology resident, what happened? Were there other things that you started to do that were COVID related and not necessarily what you were doing beforehand? Did anyone have any specific COVID experience, like whether you had to work in the ER or you had to call people back, or what did your departments and hospitals have you doing? Brittany, do you have any examples of that?
Yeah, so while I certainly know residents that were pulled from their derm-related duties to work as part of their institution's actual COVID-19 unit, like very hands-on direct patient care with COVID-positive patients, I was never in that sort of situation, never on the ED floors or ICUs, but as cases were rising and my institution was preparing for a surge, new services were created to help evaluate and manage COVID-positive patients. So to fill the surge needs at my hospital, my co-residents and I, and actually the faculty as well, kind of filled the role of results management. So
results management.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us results management. Tell us about, we as dermatologists, we do a lot of procedures, which means that our patients need to be notified. So how did you take that skill and turn it into something that was helpful for the COVID community?
So basically, hundreds of results, positive, negative, indeterminate, were coming into our hospital system, and our department was in large part responsible for delivering those results. And it's not just about telling someone that they're COVID positive. It's explaining to them what that means, how this affects people living under the same roof as they are. How do they protect their family members? How long do they self-isolate for? It involved triaging based on their individual risk factors and what symptoms they were having into low, moderate, and high risk categories. So really risk stratifying. And this is all taking place on the phone as a dermatology resident who's usually doing, very derm specific sorts of counseling. And now suddenly I'm telling people counseling on what they should do if they feel short of breath or lightheaded or if they're coughing blood. So it's one of those things where we had to train for the role. But we all had, a year of internal medicine training that we could fall back on too. And it was very different. It was out of our comfort zone, but I think it really delivered a service that was necessary at the time. It was very, very large volumes of results coming through. So it was a role that needed to be filled, and it was a piece that we could contribute to fairly easily. I think we pivoted into the role seamlessly.
And let's go to Sophie next. I'm curious, you were really at the epicenter of all of this. So I'm curious to find out, what did you do? What was your role?
So I was in New York, which was the first city to have a high peak of cases. And so for the month of April, I, along with several of my dermatology co-residents, spent a month volunteering in the internal medicine department. I was on a hospital floor unit for most of the month, managing primarily COVID-19 patients. And I spent a few days at the end in the ICU. And my role was sort of a hybrid between the intern and the resident, where you were doing a lot of the floor work, but also you did a similar role to a resident as well. So yeah, it was definitely different than regular dermatology residency.
Oh, absolutely. And were you nervous about going back and doing that type of medicine?
That's a good question. I felt prepared for my intern year. I had a really awesome intern year. Shout out to CPMC in San Francisco, which prepared me really well for this role. And I had a lot of support. I had friends in the medicine department and I made new friends. So I felt very comfortable to ask questions and to get consultants, and just really felt supported throughout the whole time.
Oh, wonderful. That's great. And you may not realize this, but I've also worked in the COVID unit of my hospital as well. So I can definitely identify with that. All of the emotions. But overall, didn't it feel rewarding to give back in that way?
It was so rewarding, and I was really anxious to get in and help, hearing about all of the stories of exhausted physicians and patients who needed care. So I really felt called to be in there in the center of it, and I'm really happy that I could give back in that way.
Oh, wonderful. I'm sure you have memories forever. And Julie, what about you?
Yeah, so my hat goes off to you guys. I am so proud of my dermatology colleagues in those cities hit harder by COVID than my city. So I've had a little bit of a different experience. I'm down here in Galveston, Texas. So at the peak of the COVID cases up north, we really weren't hit too hard. We were in lockdown like everybody else, like end of March, all through April, but we really didn't have that many cases here. I think we were well under 100 cases through the whole
Oh,
lockdown.
wow.
The dermatology residents, our residents were tiered at our hospital. And so we were ready to be pulled if that was the case, but we really didn't have the need. So when everything opened up, I think people got a little bit comfortable given that we didn't have a lot of cases. And so we really just reached our largest numbers, Texas, this week. And we're kind of on a dangerous trend upward. So I think, we're trying to learn a lot from how things were handled up north. This was the first week our dermatology department actually was pulled. We started having people pulled to the COVID floors. So this week we only had one faculty and one resident pulled. And so we're hoping that the cases kind of even out, but that's not really the way the trend is going right now. So yeah, like I said, our role has been very minimal in the COVID units. We're here and we're 100% ready to help out, but there hasn't been that need here yet. And so I'm hoping it stays that way just for the community's sake.
I want to go back to Sophie to talk about just your experience with didactics. So your lectures and your typical way of learning as a resident, how was that impacted?
That's a great question. So our didactics were converted to Zoom once the lockdown began, and almost every lecture was able to just be converted to Zoom. So we were able to have that one-to-one transition. And some attendings volunteered to give us extra lectures because our clinics were not operating in the normal way. It helped compensate to make sure that we're getting enough education and training.
Okay. Yeah, that definitely sounds reasonable. And Brittany, would you agree with that? Did you have a lot of didactics convert to virtual as well?
Absolutely. Kodachromes, lectures, guest talks, everything became virtual. No more derm path unknowns at the scope. The path presenter was utilized instead. I think to accommodate our redeployment duties with the results management, the structure of didactics was changed a little bit too. We usually have 2 dedicated half days a week. But since we were now in this other role, kind of for the greater good, we switched to 1 hour each day. And it just started earlier than we would normally start. So a little bit of an earlier wake up time. But it did allow us, I would say, to have a couple of lectures from speakers that we might not normally have had in person because they were able to call in remotely from other institutions. So that was actually kind of nice. Even some former residents came on to give us talks. So that was actually a nice touch.
Great. And you mentioned path presenter. So for our listeners who are older dermatologists who may not know what path presenter is, oh my goodness, if the path shuts down and you cannot touch glass slides to review for your boards, tell them about path presenter.
So Path Presenter is this very extensive library of virtual slides that is available to anyone with an account. So I think a lot of derm residents probably switched to utilizing that when they were no longer able to use a microscope. So lots of very high yield derm path cases with the ability to point out salient features. And then also some things that are maybe a little bit more zebras or lower yield that might still be tested on the boards for interest. But I mean, the boards are going virtual too, so.
Right.
There
So
is that.
that's great practice. That's
Mhm.
great practice. I missed having my microscope at home and checking out boxes of slides and practicing them and trading the boxes with other residents. But, that's a thing of the past and you have no idea what I'm talking about, but that's okay. You enjoy your virtual world. So Julie, Julie down in Texas, since things were kind of going okay, were you all able to convert back to in-person didactics with some social distancing? How did that look? Or did you take precaution and do Zoom? What did you decide? What did you all decide to do?
Yeah, so we kind of followed the same timeline as the North, even though we weren't hit as hard. We practiced social distancing. We converted completely to virtual lectures. Our hospital had a rule on how many people could congregate at one time. I believe it was 5 or 6, definitely much lower than the amount of residents we have. We have 12 at this point. And so, we converted completely to virtual lectures via Zoom. Not much of our structure changed. Our structure is that we have academics every day from 8 to 9, and then 1 half day a week on Friday. So we just kind of converted the exact same structure into a virtual version. And like Brittany was mentioning, we had some good opportunities for maybe some lecturers that wouldn't have been able to speak to us to come in virtually, remotely from, distance and give us some really good lectures that we wouldn't have been able to get otherwise. So it hasn't been the worst thing. I miss physically being next to people, I think. I'm like a hugger kind of person, so it makes me feel like it's kind of depersonalized when you're on Zoom. But I think, the best alternative we have given the circumstances. And now with the COVID cases rising here, I think we're probably going to keep up with our virtual conferences for the foreseeable future.
Okay, great.
Dr. Heath, I just wanted to add
Sophie.
That when I was redeployed, our residents and attendings allowed us to record the lectures so that I could watch them later on, since sometimes I was busy in the hospital floors and couldn't participate on our designated time.
That's wonderful. Yeah, I think that's a great way to make you still feel included in your dermatology education while you were serving your hospital community. So I think that's great. I don't know why we don't really do more of that. So yeah, that's an excellent tip for some of the programs around the country who have not taken advantage of that yet. So thinking about doing derm differently, what about telemedicine? I mean, I don't know, you may be under a rock if you haven't noticed, but more and more dermatologists are doing teledermatology, including myself. So is this something, teledermatology or telemedicine, is that something you all were already doing? Have you noticed that it increased during this time? Tell me more about that. Is this something that you've been exposed to now and you want to continue? Tell me about that, Brittany.
So I think there were rare opportunities for telemedicine pre-COVID, but you had to express an interest. It was not built into the curriculum. Some of our faculty have a specific interest in that and increasing access to care. So, but you would have had to seek that out on your own. It was not built into our day-to-day operations. But now in response to COVID-19, I would say particularly the resident clinics, the bulk of those are all virtual, all telemedicine, video conferences. So it's gone through a few different iterations. Recognizing the need for in-person visits for urgent things, there was a half-day resident urgent clinic for a time period. I do see myself using this in medicine in general and derm in general moving forward. It's obviously great for certain things like stable conditions, follow-ups and things like that, but there's a lot of patients whose needs won't necessarily be met by telemedicine. New rashes, skin checks, it's not really something you can do in giving the patient like an appropriate level of care, I would say, with a virtual visit, or brand new patients to the practice who you've never actually laid eyes on before. So I think there are a lot of challenges that come with it too, in addition to all the benefits. We're still able to deliver care from home, from our office, without, putting patients at risk, ourselves at risk at the peak of the pandemic in our area. But I am glad to be getting the exposure now so that I can use the experience on a few different platforms, and then wherever I land for my first job can hopefully adapt quickly to whatever it is that they're using.
Right. The people who've been experienced with that during residency, you should say that you have been trained in teledermatology. It may become a new skill set that's very, very important.
Yeah.
So, Sophie, what about you? I mean, I know that you were busy on the COVID floors, but did your department take advantage of doing telemedicine?
Yes, we did. We had a telemedicine program prior to the pandemic. There was actually a resident on that rotation at any given time.
Really?
Yes.
Wow. Okay.
Yes. But we greatly expanded it once the pandemic started. We converted lots of patients who were scheduled for in-person visits straight to telederm, and the residents who were initially supposed to be in person all got switched to telederm. So we were able to continue to serve our patients throughout the peak. And we continue to see patients via telederm primarily to promote social distancing, to decrease exposure for our patients and for all of the providers. And then we can easily schedule them for in-person when they have a more complex condition or they need a biopsy or a culture. And then we've also started doing e-consults for outpatients who present to primary care clinics in our community, and as a first step for hospital consults and emergency department consults. And I agree, I definitely plan to do telemedicine post-graduation.
Oh, that's great. It seems like you've had a lot of preparation intentionally, and I think it does take intention. And over the years, people have been, starting to do telemedicine more, but not, there were some telemedicine believers and some who were not believers as dermatologists. But I think the pandemic has really shown us that, yes, even if you're just doing a small amount or for a limited amount of patients, it can be very, very rewarding, not only for the patient who's very grateful to have the access, but then also to kind of break up your normal routine of what you typically would do as a dermatologist. So Julie, do you think that you all will start doing telemedicine if you haven't already started?
Yeah, so prior to the pandemic, our department did conduct telemedicine visits, but it was exclusively in our prison population. So our
interesting.
our institution sees 80% of the prison population in Texas. So
really,
we have a huge amount of patients to take care of, in addition to what we call free world patients or the non-prison population. And so for appropriately selected patients with stable or long-standing conditions, we would follow up with them via telemedicine. And so we had experience through that, but it was a very formal encounter. So we would go in to a room and there was a big TV screen, and they would go into their room at their remote location into a room with a big TV screen. And so we had experience to that extent. But when the lockdown started, our department converted to almost exclusively telemedicine visits with all of our patient populations. And so that was a different experience, getting some patients to have the technology to be able to visit with us via video conference, to be able to hook up to us, to connect to us. It was a lot different of an experience. You didn't have somebody setting both of us up on both ends. And so we definitely all learned a lot in our department. I think telemedicine is great for stable and long-standing conditions, people with long-term psoriasis, eczema, acne. It gets challenging for new like rashes and lesions, kind of like Brittany was saying. So I think it definitely has a role, but appropriate patient selection is going to be very important. It's definitely something I would consider using in the future, even after the pandemic has hopefully left us. And so I think it's going to be a powerful tool going forward.
Oh, yes, I definitely agree with you. And it's just so fascinating to hear about what a lot of the departments are doing. Of course, we think about visually making sure that you know how to identify diseases, that you know how to do surgery, that you know how to do path. But these other skill sets are very, very important and can definitely boost your CV and even maybe help you land a job in the future, providing that service to a community that really needs it. So speaking of community, let's talk about our dermatology community. So brand new residents have just hit all of the dermatology departments. And guess what? The dermatology experience that they interviewed in and have waited to start, it looks different. The setup is different. You know, we're doing all of these different things. Do you have any advice for residents who had their hearts set on going to this program because they have it this way and they do this and this is going to be perfect, I can't wait, and then they show up to a COVID dermatology program? Do you have any advice? So Sophie's laughing the hardest, so I will ask her first. Do you have any advice for these wide-eyed dermatology residents who just started? What would you tell them? What advice would you give?
I'm laughing because I'm imagining how overwhelmed they must feel. So my first piece of advice is to be easy on yourself. It's a lot to get used to. There's a lot of administrative and technical changes. So just focus on becoming comfortable with the medical record, the flow of clinic, and just know that we also are getting used to all of these changes. So it's not just you that's confused about what's the next step. So don't be hard on yourself if it takes time to acclimate to these systems. And I would also advise a lot of self-directed studying. So create and maintain a reading schedule to make sure that you're getting the most out of each patient encounter, and write down any clinical questions that you have as they come up, and ask a senior resident or an attending to go over these topics with you periodically. I find that doing this rather than asking questions right when they come up is better because it interrupts the flow of the day less.
Oh, I think that's great advice. What about you, Brittany? What advice would you give?
So, I mean, to echo what Sophie said a little bit, I kind of tell them, look, you know, we're all adapting to the new normal together. Just because I've been here for the past 5 months during the pandemic doesn't mean that that necessarily gives me a leg up compared to you, because things are still changing so rapidly, whether that be about our clinic staffing, number of in-person clinics versus telederm clinics, who's on site, who's not, new rotations created to kind of offset the decreased volume. So like you said, it's learning to be flexible, adaptation. We're all kind of in this together, and you're not at this huge disadvantage because you're just now starting. And with the flexibility component, you know, we're seeing cases rise in certain parts of the country, like Julie alluded to. So we don't really know what things are going to look like in 1 month and 2 months. You know, in my area in Philadelphia, are we going to see another surge at some point, you know, after, you know, steady decrease in number of cases and admissions for COVID? And then again, although they're starting residency in a time of political divide, this raging pandemic, and like a lot of racial tensions and injustice that's been going on, it doesn't really take away from what they did to get here. We're still excited to have them start. They are still very accomplished, and we're here committed to helping them acclimate and also to learn. And there's still plenty of opportunity for education, even though the volume is a little bit lower. So we're no less excited to have them here. So little piece of hope too.
Great. And what advice would you give, Julie?
One word that comes to mind, and I think kind of captures what both Sophie and Brittany have to say, as well as the word patience. And that's the word that I think is the most valuable lesson I learned over the past 5 months. Everything's changing on a day-to-day basis. The COVID situation's changing. The rules and policies are changing in our hospital. What was protocol yesterday might not be protocol today. That causes some people to feel tense in the environment, to feel a little bit uncomfortable. But I think just having patience, being adaptable, and just realizing that, hey, everybody is going through the exact same thing, and everybody's weathering the same storms that there are in our world today, I think, you know, is really the best advice I would have for people, as well as myself.
Yes, and really taking it all in is important. So Julie, is there something that, if this pandemic had not happened, is there something medically that you did not know well, or you did not know at all, that now, because of this experience, you learned it and you're happy you did?
I will say the pandemic for me came at an interesting time because I was in my chief year of residency. And so board exams were originally scheduled for this month, July. They've now been postponed, but at the time of, the lockdown, I was thinking my board exam was going to be in July. So it actually gave me a lot of time to sit back and kind of tie all the loose ends. I think from residency, you learn so much. Residency is so fast paced. You're just sprinting, it feels like, the whole time. And to be able to kind of sit down for a little bit and kind of tie in all the loose ends was really valuable for me. I know that not everybody gets that opportunity. Probably they won't ever again in dermatology residency. Knock on wood. I hope nobody has that situation happen to them in the future. But I wouldn't say, medically, like I said, I wasn't too involved in the actual caring of COVID patients. I kept myself up to date on kind of the general course of disease, and there's some interesting dermatologic manifestations I'm sure we've all read about coming out in our journals, but I think that was a valuable learning experience for me.
And what about you, Brittany? What is the thing that you learned?
Yeah, so I am thinking broadly too. Medically, I guess, would be the root of it. So for me, the pandemic, kind of once again brought to the forefront the health disparities that we already know exist in racial and ethnic minority groups and marginalized groups. So seeing that again, I guess, brought that to the forefront in my mind again as well, and allowed me to kind of start building this framework in my mind of what should be done to address these and overcome these divisions and disparities moving forward. So, for better, for worse, I think I've been so focused on my medical training for so long, reading textbooks, reading review books, journal articles, studying, that I didn't really make time for hobbies or outside interests. So kind of this newly found interest in public health and health disparities that I've tapped into during the pandemic is something that probably would not have happened if I hadn't had more time to read about these things. And, looking up one article leads to 5 others. And I might have not had that time if it weren't for the pandemic. So new interest for me in public health.
Yeah, I think that's amazing. That really is. And you're right. Sometimes it takes something that happens that makes you sit still for all of these revelations to come to you. So that's great. And what about you, Sophie? You may not have had a chance to sit still, but have you learned anything medically? I'm sure you learned a ton, working on the COVID unit. Is there something that stands out to you from your experiences during the pandemic that you learned?
Yeah, certainly I understand COVID itself better than I would have if I hadn't been caring for COVID patients directly, especially the impact on multiple organ systems, which wasn't widely reported earlier this spring, which proves to be helpful in educating my patients and my family and my friends and my community about what the disease is like, how it can impact a person in the short run and in the long run. And just how they can best protect themselves. Another thing that working as a part of the primary team really brought me gratitude for consultants. There were times where I was truly stuck and appreciated the expertise. Things that were basic to them were completely foreign to me. So now I have more patience when the primary team calls me as a consultant now that I'm back in dermatology, because I know firsthand how helpful a consultant can be.
That's definitely a valuable lesson. So you know how the person feels on the other end of the phone when they say, "Oh, dermatology, oh great, we have a patient with a macular rash, they have a fever. We
forget
we
quickly,
need help.
don't we? What it's like.
We need a consult for a biopsy stat."
Yeah.
So now you can handle it with grace and say, "Oh, I hear your angst. I'm super, concerned about your patient as well. Let's back up and get some information."
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, I can remember, those situations as well. So definitely some great learning points that you all have learned during the pandemic. And just speaking about social interactions, we kind of talked about it a little bit, but this is a time to get close to your co-residents and a time to talk to family because you need support. You're going through a stressful time. What have you done to really stay connected with people? And we'll start with Julie. During this pandemic, it's just odd. Everything has changed.
Yeah, I think everybody has experienced kind of this sense of too much time on their hands in some sense for those of us who aren't being pulled to areas and times of need. But for here in our department, we've had a couple of dermatology happy hours where our whole department will get on Zoom, and like all our faculty and all our residents and all the pets and babies will get on the computer. And it's kind of overwhelming, but it makes you feel at the same time just very like, we're all in this together and we're all going through this weird time, but we're going through the weird time together. And so I would say, virtual meetings have been kind of the new social norm. There are a lot of college friend groups and friend groups I've had from childhood that we just decided, hey, let's have a Zoom meeting, and we haven't talked in, 4 or 5 months. It just kind of brings you together in a different way. And so here in Texas, I live in Galveston, so I'm on a beach, on an ocean. There's a lot of like outdoor things that people can do, running, walking in a socially distanced manner.
Oh, rub it in, won't you?
The types of fun have just changed, but I think, those are keeping us going. So,
well, good. And Sophie, what about you? How do you stay connected?
My family and I started doing Zoom Friday night dinner for Shabbat, which is something that we all look forward to every day. Yeah, every week.
Oh, that's nice.
It's really nice. And then I've made time to FaceTime with different groups of friends and individually. And we had a really nice Zoom resident graduation for the residents who just finished, with slideshows and speeches and videos that we all made. And I think some of us actually thought there were some benefits compared to in-person graduation celebrations.
Oh, great. Well, maybe they will adapt that for the future, even when the social distancing guidelines are a little bit more relaxed. What about you, Brittany? How have you stayed connected?
Pretty similar. So Zoom has just become a part of everyday life at this point. Kind of similar to what Julie said. I've actually had more reunions with certain groups of people that would not otherwise have been able to all be present, come together, facilitated because it was a virtual meeting. So college friends, med school besties. If you've never done a virtual game nights with friends and family, you have to try it. There are a multitude of different ways to do it. So Jackbox Games, it's a website. You have to, I think it's an app that you have to have, but multiple people in remote locations can play. Codenames is another really fun one that people can play in teams. I feel like there's no limit to the number of people who could be part of that. So a lot of game nights with family and friends as well. And then we did have a couple residency-wide birthday parties on Zoom. Again, lots of pets and babies in attendance. And then also I have a baby shower, a virtual baby shower coming up in a week. So that's how we're staying connected. So,
hold on. Who has a baby shower? You're attending one, or you're the guest of honor?
I'm attending one.
Oh, I was gonna say,
worries.
wow! Breaking news.
This is my announcement.
Derm Weekly podcast. You heard it here first, ladies.
Blew my
and
cover.
Gentlemen.
Is this TMZ or
That's the joke. She's an attendee.
I should go tell my program director now.
Baby. COVID baby. Well, great. I loved all of the things that you all are doing to stay connected. Great ideas. People are raving about the game night stuff as well. Yeah, I'm definitely hopping on Zoom with family and friends. Yes. So I have a final parting question for all of you. And I'll start with Julie first. And this is my question. Mm-hmm. If you could wave your magic wand as a derm resident, what would be the wish that you would want granted today?
Besides the obvious answer, which would be waving COVID out of existence. I think secondarily, just for the world to become one of better understanding. I think all of us, our nation, our world has undergone quite a bit over the past few months. And I think now more than ever, it's important for us just to recognize each other as all humans and just to have better understanding for one another. And I think that will help us pull us out of kind of this darker time.
Oh, I think that's great. What about you, Sophie? I will ask you the question as well. If you could wave your magic derm resident wand, what would be the wish you want granted today?
I love this question. And similar to what Brittany was reflecting earlier, we've seen reports how COVID is disproportionately affecting Black and Hispanic communities and individuals, and exacerbating differences in health status. And this is something I witnessed firsthand as a first-line COVID doctor. The vast majority of my patients were Black and Hispanic. So it's something that I'm hopeful will change in the coming months and years, thanks to increasing activism. But if I had a magic wand, I would waive those disparities.
Oh, wow. That's amazing. That's great. And finally, last but not least, Brittany, if you could wave your magic derm resident wand, what would be the wish you want granted today?
So I think you made this question because you know it's a really hard question to ask during an election year, during a massive global pandemic, and when, you know, racial and social inequalities are on everyone's mind all at the same time, like a perfect storm. But I think we're all on the same wavelength. So there's a lot of healing that needs to occur. Sure, in the nation, the world at large, but also on an individual level. I think we fall into the trap of having very rigid ways of thinking, and that stands in the way of identifying alternative solutions to problems that need fixing. So I guess if I would wave my wand, it would be to invite everyone to challenge the way they think every once in a while. It's okay to change your opinion when presented with new information. Realize that, you know, while we might have different priorities, we're raised a little bit differently, different parts of the country, so have a different outlook on life, that at our core, we want similar things for ourselves, for our families, for our kids, and that we're not so different. And if we just stepped outside of our own bubble into someone else's shoes, I think, you know, we're more alike than we are different. And we read about, you know, these horrible interactions that happen, and online can be a very troubling place to have discourse because people hide behind, you know, the shield of their computers. But it's so much easier to be, you know, bitter and nasty face to face. So if we talk face to face more and are more open and understanding, like Julie said, trying to learn about one another, I think it would make such a huge difference and lead to a lot of progress that we're all hoping for. I think it'll take a long time in reality, so the wand would speed up that process.
Well, ladies, you have really impressed me. No one said anything about, you know, eliminating all student debts or, you know, being forever young or anything like that. So you all were very, very deep with your responses, and I do appreciate that. And with that, I would definitely like to say thank you to each of you. Thank you, Dr. Brittany Oliver, Dr. Julie Croley, Dr. Sophie Greenberg. And this is Dr. Candrice Heath, your favorite fun board-certified dermatologist, your go-to girl for everything healthy hair, skin, and nails. And yes, your guest host of COVID Conversations podcast series. Thank you for joining, and stay safe.
And that's it for episode 73 of Dermatology Weekly. Derm Weekly is produced by MD Edge editors Melissa Sears and Elizabeth Meshkati. The news portion of your show is written by myself, voiced by myself, and produced by Elizabeth Meshkati. Dr. Ted Rosen was my guest in episode 73. The peer-to-peer portion of the show is produced by Melissa Sears. It was hosted by Dr. Candrice Heath. The peer-to-peer portion is also engineered and produced by Tyler Mundek. All MD Edge podcasts are produced by MD Edge executive editor Kathy Skarbeck and the vice president of Medscape, Dr. Ivan Aransky. Social media for Dermatology Weekly is produced by Kyla Clark. I am the voice of the news portion of Dermatology Weekly, Nick Andrews. You're listening to MD Edge Podcasts.